Yes, I wanted my talk to be called Who Do We Think We Are? Because I believe this is at the root of all our problems. I don't think that we just have a series of minor glitches, that we started off so well, and then suddenly somebody told us that the weather was changing, and the seas were poisoned, and the forests were disappearing, and societal breakdown was occurring. I think all of these are rooted in one much bigger thing, which is we no longer have the foggiest idea what a human being is, what a society is, and how the two relate. Hence the title of my later book, as you say, 18 months ago, called The Matter with Things, subtitled Delusions, Our Brains Are Delusions and the Unmaking of the World. And the title refers in sort of several levels to the fact that clearly most of us think there is something to the matter, and the problem is to do with our obsession with mere matter and with the idea that the world is made up of things. I don't believe it is. I believe that it is made of relationships, not of things, but I can come to that later if you'd like. But why should I be talking about the brain at all? The first thing to clear up is I don't think that the brain causes societal change or causes different ways of thinking. And I don't think that consciousness is emitted by the brain. I think there are three possibilities about consciousness. It could be emitted, it could be transmitted, or it could be permitted by the brain. And I take the third of these routes in a longish chapter, a short book on matter and consciousness, which is in The Matter of Things. Instead, I think you should think of the brain rather like the banks of a river. The banks of the river don't make the river. They don't explain it away. They are not the river itself. But without the banks, there is no river. And the brain is what modulates, shapes the way in which we think. And therefore, it's interesting to look at how it is structured. I'll do what Jonathan Rouse calls the McGilchrist 101 very, very quickly, just to sort of get that out of the way. If you like, there are three important questions, none of which were asked in medical school. There is this brain. Why on earth is it divided? Why is it asymmetrical? And why is the band of fibers that connects the two hemispheres of the brain, known as the corpus callosum, why is it at least as much, if not more, inhibitory than facilitatory in its transmission? What is going on here? And to cut a very, very, very long story short, I believe this arises out of evolution for perfectly understandable reasons. We know that this division and this asymmetry are there in every neural network we've looked at, not just, of course, in humans, not even in mammals, not even in reptiles, amphibians, but also in fish, in birds, in insects, in a sea creature 700 million years old, Nematostella vectensis, living off the Isle of Wight, where it migrated in order to be more or less in company with people of the same age. But anyway, it also already has these features of asymmetry at any rate. Why is this? I believe it's for a very straightforward reason. All creatures have to solve the problem of how to live and stay alive. And I know that doesn't sound like a big conundrum, but it is. Because in order to eat, you have to pay a kind of sharply focused, already committed attention to a detail that you want to grab, be it a seed, be it a twig to build a nest, be it a rabbit that you want to eat. You've got to lock on to something you already know and pay very precise attention to it. But if that's the only attention that you pay, at the same time, you will become somebody else's lunch while you're getting yours. So it's very important that you should be able to see everything else that is going on. And effectively, the left hemisphere has been tasked with one thing, which is to enable us to manipulate the environment, which we've done very well until recently, very badly now. So what we're doing here is seeing a part of the brain that is dedicated to fulfilling our need to grasp and get. And pretty much the whole of the rest has been outsourced to the right hemisphere. In other words, the right hemisphere has been left doing the job of understanding the world. If you want a soundbite, the left hemisphere helps us manipulate the world, the right hemisphere helps us understand the world. The difference here is one of attention, and I believe attention is very much more important than it sounds. It's not just another cognitive function, it is foundational. I call attention a moral act, for this reason, that the way in which you pay attention to something changes what it is that is there. And it also changes you who are doing the attending. So it has grave consequences. If you see things only with the eye of a mechanist, you will see only mechanical things responding to that kind of attention. And you yourself will become a person who is somewhat detached from, I believe, all the things that make life worth living, and instead focus purely on a skeletal cognitive frame. Louis Laval, an existentialist French philosopher of the first part of the 20th century, says something very simple but very important. La charité est une pure attention à l'existence d'autrui. In other words, love is a pure attention to the existence of the other. Now, can AI attend at all? Attention is something a computer certainly can't do. Attention requires the disposition of your consciousness towards another. And so that's already something. I'm not going to keep droning on about can AI do this, but after everything I say, I would like you to ask yourself the question, could AI do this? So this difference of attention gives rise to a different experienced world, a different phenomenological world. And if I had to do this, and there's a lot of subtlety and interest in this, but if I try to do it very quickly, the left hemisphere's version of the world is like a map, a theory, a diagram. It's useful in that it leaves almost everything out. A map doesn't get better for including all kinds of for the purposes of the map, irrelevant details. And it helps us manipulate. So what it sees is small, isolated, atomistic elements that are fixed in space and time, because that's the tension that allows you to grab it, that are decontextualized, disembodied, abstracted, generalized, placed in categories, and effectively inanimate. Whereas the right hemisphere sees a world in which nothing is ever atomistic, in which, in the end, it is not only connected to the things in its immediate environment, but also connected to, ultimately, probably everything. That it is never fixed and static, but always in motion, always flowing and changing. That its context and its embodiment matter greatly. It can see the difference between individual cases, whereas the left hemispheres lump them all together as examples of that. So that's a rather important distinction. And effectively what it sees is an animate world. And I'm not just using that figuratively. If you suppress one hemisphere at a time, which you can do with a painless process called transcranial magnetic stimulation, you'll find that people with their left hemisphere suppressed see the world as animate. People with their right hemisphere suppressed see the world as inanimate, including obviously living beings. So that is pretty essential. So the point is that the left hemisphere's vision is very simple, and it lends itself to expression in language, whereas what the right hemisphere sees is truer, but much harder to comprehend and to express in language, and therefore less useful. Its purpose is for the broader and longer term understanding, and for that it is absolutely essential. Now, these hemispheres work together most of the time, as people are constantly reminding me, so I needed reminding. But they can, in certain circumstances, for example, after a stroke or tumor or head injury, they can be separated. They can be separated immediately in the laboratory. As I say, by certain procedures. It used to be things like ECT, but now, as I say, fortunately, we can do it with TMS. But what I'm saying is that although they work together, at times they leave their imprint on our thinking. And what happens is that when we are forced to articulate our understanding of the world in words and concepts, we are forced towards a coherent picture that doesn't involve any apparently contradictory elements. If you contradict yourself, that's almost the greatest sin you can commit nowadays. But in fact, a full understanding of the world would lead you often to saying, we have to have this and that, not just one thing. So what happens is that as a society becomes more self-reflective, it tends to drift towards this left hemisphere version of the world. And I didn't know this until actually this year. Somebody drew my attention to a phrase in Whitehead where he says a civilization flourishes until it begins to analyze itself. And so the role of reflection here is to unweave this relationship and shift the emphasis towards the left hemisphere view. Now, for those of you who've read The Master and His Emissary, you'll know that the second half of it is an attempt to review the history of ideas from the Greeks up to postmodernism. And what I see is various shifts, sometimes towards the left hemisphere's view, sometimes more towards the right hemisphere's view. But overall, what we see is a civilization beginning with these two very well held in balance in, say, 6th century BC in Greece, around the year dot in Rome, and around probably 1400 in Europe. But then there is, with various little adjustments, an inexorable move towards the left hemisphere's view, after which the society, the civilization, collapses. So, just to give you some idea very quickly of the matter with things, and then I'll move on to specifics about spiritual intelligence. In the first, it falls into three parts, two physical volumes of three parts. The first part is neuropsychology. And what I'm aiming to do there is look at all the ways in which we could gather a sense of what is actually going on in the world around us. And I take these to be attention, perception, judgment formed on what we attend to and what we perceive, our emotional and social intelligence, our cognitive intelligence, good old-fashioned IQ, and a degree of creativity, because nothing ever just presents itself blank. But we always have to do some little mental work it often happens in milliseconds, so we don't notice it, as to what it is that we're looking at. And in all of these, I can demonstrate, and do demonstrate at great length, extremely well referenced to the literature, that the right hemisphere is superior to the left. Now that doesn't sound reasonable. Why would the left hemisphere be sitting there doing nothing? Well, it's not. As I said, it's a great manipulator. And it helps us apprehend rather than comprehend the world. Comprehendery means to hold together. Apprehendery means grasping on to something. And that is exceptionally good, either through the body or through language, which is a way of pinning things down and manipulating them. Or it can be. It's more than that. In the second part of the book is epistemology, and I reckon there are probably four paths that we could pursue towards a relative understanding of the truth. I don't think there is such a thing as the fixed truth that anyone will ever come up with, but at least we couldn't get out of bed, or we wouldn't bother coming here, we wouldn't be talking at all if we didn't believe that some things are truer than others. So how do we pursue those? I reckon we pursue them through science, I believe that, I'm sure most people do, through reason, through intuition, and through imagination. And effectively, I think the last two are extraordinarily important, at least as important, if not much more important than the first two. They tend to be neglected these days, and they're by no means unreliable. Following a purely rationalizing kind of schema leads you to terrific mistakes, in fact, frank delusions. As Chesterton said, the madman is not someone who's lost his reason. He's lost everything but his reason. And that leads you into deducing perfectly logical but quite absurd conclusions that the voices that you're hearing don't come out of your mind, but come through the electricity supply or from the neighbours, for example. And in short, what I think is that we need all four of these. I'm a great advocate for science and for reason, and I hope that I am a writer who draws on these things appropriately. But I think we also need intuition and imagination very greatly. And in each of these four, the right hemisphere is a better contributor than the left. That might surprise you. What about science? What about reason? Well, the answer is that science does use the left hemisphere very much in its everyday proceduralizing of an experiment and so forth. But actually, if you look at the descriptions of the great discoveries by scientists and mathematicians, they don't happen in this way at all. They happen after a period of gestation, at the end of which there's a gestalt shift and a sudden revelation, an aha moment, which is robustly associated with the right superior temporal gyrus and sulcus. And in the third part of the book, I say, well, okay, given we've got some guides here that when we see the right hemisphere working, we shouldn't disregard what the left hemisphere is saying, but it's likely we're going to get something more like the truth out of attending to what the right hemisphere is saying. And we need to use all of these powers in our approach. So I take that to look at the cosmos in part 3, which is metaphysics or ontology. And in the first 2 chapters, I talk about the coincidence of opposites and the conundrum of the one and the many, which I think are absolutely essential to the structure of reality. And then I move on to looking at what you might call, or what some people would call, the building blocks of the cosmos, things like time, flow, very importantly, and space, matter, consciousness, but also values, purpose, and the sense of the sacred, which surprises a lot of people. But I come to the conclusion that these are fundamental to the cosmos and are not just sort of things we paint on to cheer ourselves up. We don't invent them, we discover them or fail to discover them. And whether we do or don't is one of the reasons our lives have meaning and importance. So to come on to talking about how this might apply to an appreciation of the sacred, of the divine, of what we call, in that rather vague way, spiritual. I think the first thing is otherness. So whatever this is, it's not easily graspable by the words which were designed to help us lay the table and do the sort of dishes. It's not everyday language, and its conceptions will not conform to the conceptions we have made on our limited purview of the world we experience daily. In fact, it transcends conceptions or words. This is something that is common, I think, to pretty much all religious and spiritual traditions. The right hemisphere is the one that is alert to the unfamiliar and the unknown and is able to see beyond the bounds of what it has created as familiar. Ramachandran, a great neuroscientist, calls the right hemisphere the devil's advocate, whereas the left hemisphere is quick and dirty and jumps to conclusions. The right hemisphere goes, hang on a minute, it might not be like that. And there's evidence that the left hemisphere sees truth as internal consistency over moral. And that's, of course, never going to get us to the divine. Associated with this is the important idea of uncertainty. The capacity for uncertainty, not as a weakness in our thinking, but an idea that we're being truthful and honorable in our approach to what it is we're looking at. The left hemisphere is incapable of what Keats very famously called negative capability, being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without irritably reaching after fact and reason. And we need to be able to hold with that very important insight if we're to understand a work of art, if we're to understand a person, if we're to understand the meaning of our lives, if we're to understand the divine above all. The left hemisphere wants to collapse to a certainty. Is it this or is it that? It's black and white, either or. The idea that it might be both and. We need the both and kind of thinking, but we also do need the either or thinking. And so I say we don't need either both and or either or. We need both and either or in our thinking. But the left hemisphere is relatively incapable of the tentative, careful, as Heidegger would say, fürsorgend, reaching out towards what lies beyond what we think we already know. We're not blind when we respond to intimations of the sacred. There's something there that we know to be real, but we can't pin it down. But the fact we can't pin it down is not a weakness. It's a sign that we're on the path towards something, in my view. Could somebody very kindly get me a glass of water? Betweenness is the next thing I want to talk about, which is an interesting concept. I don't just mean what lies between. Where is the electricity in an electrical circuit? Is it in the positive terminal? No. Is it in the negative terminal? No. Is it in just the space between them? No. It's in the whole ensemble and what it gives rise to, which is something utterly new. In a sense, this is what Hegel called Aufhebung, unfortunately translated as sublation, which nobody uses in ordinary speech. It is basically the idea of two things coming together and being, thank you very much, and being lifted up into something new that has new qualities. And that suggests that attention to the whole of something will reveal more than attention to just some part of it. What it also suggests is that relationships are primary. Perhaps the best example of this is music. What is a single note? Nothing special, doesn't mean anything. Have another note, it also doesn't mean anything. Put 30,000 of them together and you've got a piece by Bach that would change your life. What has happened? It's all in the spaces, it's all in relationships. Again, not just empty spaces, but betweennesses, between the notes. Sequentially, they give rise to melody. At a moment in time, they give rise to harmony. Over time, there is also the pulsation, the ictus that we call rhythm. So that is a significant concept. And it suggests to me, and I haven't got time to explain why I say this really, that relationships are prior to relata, the things that are related. And that sounds odd to our way of thinking, because how can you relate things that don't already exist? But the problem is this, that what they are, as what we call things, only emerges from the network of what they are embedded in and the situation in which they find themselves, the whole overall context. So a nice image for me is one from the Vedanta, which is of Indra's net. And this is the idea of a net that is placed over the cosmos. And at every intersection of the net, there hangs a jewel. And in each jewel is imaged all the other jewels in the net. This brings to focus a whole lot of things, that the relationships are primary and that the things are the things we put a little pendant on and say, that's a thing, but actually it's just where relationships make something new. And that each of these new elements arising out of the net in a sort of holarchy, as Kirsten would say, contains all the others. So it's almost, it has that connection in amongst its separation and the notion of the thing subservient to the relationships. All this suggests that context is very important. And in fact, context matters almost more than anything because it changes utterly what there is. I sometimes rather frivolously give the example of cereal packets in America, which have 4 sizes. There's jumbo, which means very large. There's economy, which means large. There's family, which means medium. And finally, there's large, which means small. Context changes can radically invert the meaning of anything. And the trouble with the world that we now live in is that things are taken out of context, reduced to a soundbite, whizzed around the world, and don't really give anybody any insight into what was intended. These relations, I believe, are also responsive, and they are, in that sense, two-way relationships. Nothing is one way, I believe, in this world. When we interact, whatever that interaction is, both parties are changed by it. There's no such thing as standing, as it were, protected from the idea that you will be changed by an experience. And all of this idea of relationship, of betweenness, of context, also, I think, resonates with some of the realities described by quantum field theory. The idea that particles are an actualization at a point of the potential in a whole field. And we now know, last year's Nobel Prize being awarded to physicists who had described quantum entanglement, that things are connected in ways we don't entirely understand and can't explain according to a mechanical version of the physical world. Now, this has implications. First of all, it's very bad when we decontextualize anything. Then that making something explicit, in other words, decontextualizes, it changes the nature of what it is we're looking at. It also suggests that we are co-creators of ourselves and of whatever it is that exists apart from ourselves. I believe that these interchanges, which are our reality, these encounters, help bring something about and help us become more of what we are. Ultimately, we're not describing reality as if from outside, but are immersed in it, and our understanding is and has to be participatory. And interestingly, John Archibald Wheeler, a very great physicist, said we live in a participatory universe, looking at things merely from the physicist's point of view. Then there's paradox, and the right hemisphere is better at holding together apparently conflicting positions. According to the left hemisphere, a thing cannot be both static and in motion, separate and connected, divisible and indivisible, precisely measurable and intrinsically imprecise at the same time. But we now know that these things are possible, and most of the non-systematic, but I think more important mystical theology suggests exactly that a thing and its opposite may need to be held together and coexist and actually partake in one another's existence. You cannot have cold without heat, as you already know all this. And the right hemisphere is less likely than the left hemisphere to ignore or simply not see whatever doesn't fit the paradigm it already holds. And how much you miss when you pay focused attention is beautifully illustrated by a film you may have seen called Gorillas in Our Midst, in which if you're asked to focus very particularly on how many times members of a basketball team pass the ball to somebody with their own coloured T-shirt on, you can work out that the answer is 14. But at the end of this exercise, most people who see it for the first time have not noticed because their attention is locked on to counting how many times the ball moves in these players moving around. They don't see that there's a man in a gorilla suit who walks into the middle of the thing, turns to the camera, beats his chest, dances a little jig, and then walks out. So it's the things we don't expect that we don't get to see. And that's much more likely to happen when we use a left hemisphere way of conceiving the world. Also, briefly, I think I would like to make a remark about causation. The left hemisphere sees this as a linear process in which A leads to B leads to C and so on. But I think the right hemisphere is more able to see complexity, re-entrant loops, and an idea that in fact the better way to understand causation is by looking at the whole context. And I'd like to give the instance of Pavlov's dog. Pavlov's dog is turned into a mechanism by the thought that it hears a bell and therefore salivates and therefore eats. But in fact, if you did the experiment differently, and after the dog was already engaged in eating, always rang a bell, and when you rang a bell at any other time, it would link to that context in which it's linked to food, but it wouldn't make the dog appear mechanical, it would make it appear intelligent. Embodiment is very important as well. We've talked a bit about that, but perhaps we can never talk about it enough. Everything we know is embodied and cannot be abstracted without distorting its essential nature. Spirit and body are not separate. They are distinguishable, but as part of a whole, and they're certainly not opposed, but discernibly different aspects of the same being. Also, when I speak of the body, I don't mean the limited body that we can see standing here, but the body has no sharp edges. Bodies leach into the environment. The environment becomes part of their being, and their being becomes part of the environment of that person. There's a very good book called Interdependence by an American biologist called Kriti Sharma, who I hope to interview fairly soon, which I found extremely good on this question of how biology is not at all like the particular way in which it's described, but is in fact profoundly interconnected. Then there's the idea of uniqueness. Now, uniqueness is very important. I think all of us feel denatured when we become just a number or another category of person. But our thisness and the thisness of every blade of grass is something different from the others. And this is a central point of the philosophy and poetry of Gerard Manley Hopkins. But it's lost sight of in modernity because we're all grouped together to think in mass terms. But in fact, we need to recover the importance of fluidity. And this comes from the right hemisphere. 2 cases in Switzerland of people who had right temporary parietal strokes. One of them was a farmer who knew all his cows by name, but after his stroke, he couldn't, well, he could, but he could hardly tell the difference between a cow and a horse. Certainly couldn't recognize the cows. And perhaps even more poignantly, a woman who'd made it her life's work to know all the birds of Switzerland after a right temporary parietal stroke said plaintively, all the birds look the same. Another important point is Gestalt perception. The Gestalt, we don't have a word in English, that's why I use it, is the word in German for something that as a whole is more than its decomposition into parts. Actually, I believe that to be true of everything except a machine. And so possibly even that. So it's a very important concept, and it should be ringing alarm bells when we think that we've discovered what something is by simply taking it apart. We can discover more about it by taking it apart. I don't deny that. I think analysis is enormously important, but second only to our capacity to re-synthesize to a new enriched whole. This is to do with pattern recognition, and not just pattern recognition in the way that they now train computers to recognize a melanoma or something like that, in which basically it's taking thousands, possibly millions, I don't know, of photographs and just going, well, it's got most of these features. That's not what I mean. I mean a Gestalt shift in which you suddenly see something from a quite different perspective. Then there is the question of what knowledge, belief, and truth are. So much to say. I mean, in the case of knowledge, I think I've often made this point, maybe it's already been made this session. In English, we just have this one word to know, but in most other languages, there's a distinction between knowing from experience and knowing the facts of. Knowing that Paris is the capital of France is different from knowing Paris because you've lived there for a decade. And belief and truth have also. So the way in which you use, I think one of the problems with the Anglo-American analytic tradition actually is that we don't have different words for knowing. A lot of confusion has been caused by that. And we now think of belief as a propositional thing, whereas I believe belief is something else altogether. It's a loving relationship. In fact, the root is from lieben, it went into English as leaf, it's now become archaic. But it was about a relationship in which you were true to something. And again, truth is not about having a thing out there that we can locate a path to, but it's about something that emerges from an honest, honourable attempt to be truthful to what it is that one finds. Then there is the problem of the implicit and mythos and how they're being discarded in favour of the explicit and logos. No time to go into all of that because it takes up quite a chunk of part 2 of the matter of things. But let me just say this. The right hemisphere understands metaphor, myth, narrative, music, and poetry, faculties that are grossly impaired in people with right hemisphere damage. the richness of these implicit paths to knowledge, which also, by the way, include drama and ritual, is essential, I believe, to spiritual understanding. Thus, the attempt to try and work it out schematically is doomed at the outset. We also need to relinquish control. I mean, again, is AI going to help us relinquish control? It's a manifestation of our insane desire for control. And I just briefly here tell this probably well known to you story, a Chinese traditional story, about a man who has some horses. One day the horses go off onto the hills and he's lost them. And his neighbors say, "Oh dear, how sad, what bad luck." And he says, "Well, bad luck, good luck, who knows?" And the next day, his horse comes back with other horses that it found and suddenly has lost. And people say, "Oh, what good luck." And he says, "Well, good luck, bad luck, who knows?" The next day, his son tries to break in the new horses and falls off and breaks his arm. "Oh, what bad luck." And the man says, "Well, bad luck, good luck, who knows?" And the next day, a recruiter for the Chinese army comes through the village and takes all the young men except the man's son. And they say, "What good luck?" He says, "Well," so we don't know what it is we're doing. We don't know what it is we want until we get there. This leads to the idea, the very important idea of emptiness, which is an important idea, of course, in Buddhism and in Eastern mythology. And this emptiness is not a passive emptiness. It's rather like the space in a womb that is prepared to receive something, or the space within a seed that is germinating. It has potential. It's not a sort of flabby emptiness of a negative, purely negative kind. It is something rich with possibility. And we need to be able to empty ourselves in order to receive what it is that is important, because if it's full of our ideas and preconceptions already, we won't get it. And at the level of phenomenology, meditation and mindfulness, particularly mindfulness, succeed primarily by freeing right hemisphere consciousness from left hemisphere processing. Compassion meditation requires engagement with the right frontal cortex, and mindfulness is an attempt to encounter experience behind and beyond verbalization and conceptualization. And we know that it does, in fact, engage widely distributed networks, principally in the right hemisphere. That brings me to negation. We think of negation as purely negative, but it isn't. It's profoundly creative. There is creative power in stillness and silence, in not knowing and not doing. And the Buddha said the greatest prayer is patience, and that places letting go, reticence, withholding judgment and acceptance ahead of striving, judging and knowing at the core of spiritual wisdom. That's related to my concept of active passivity, a business of being attentive. One's senses are on the alert for something that one knows is there, but not collapsing it into something, "Oh, I see, it's one of those," too eagerly. In other words, there are things that come into being through openness to what is. There is also a necessary vulnerability involved in this. A necessary vulnerability. If we make ourselves invulnerable, we don't experience many things in life. And the desire to make ourselves invulnerable, to be worried about our vulnerability, to say that we're fragile, we're going to be hurt and offended by things, is part of the sickness in our society, in my belief. In the Christian mythos of the incarnation lies the idea of the submission of a greater power to a form of resistance or constraint in order that something still greater can come about. This progression of potentiality to actuality, of becoming to being, involves an intrinsic sacrifice or self-limiting process in the interest of being an actualized world and its beings at all. Then we need to be aware of the dark side. Can a computer do that? It's a Greek saying, when God builds a church, the devil builds one right next door. Most humans can't tell the difference between something that looks very much like a spiritual truth and something that is actually the reverse of that, which is going to harm. And if you believe that truth is so important, we must write it down in a sacred text and adore that text, that in a way creates the kind of rigidity that the spiritual life is opposed to. And going along with this is the value of suffering, going through suffering. A deep distress hath humanized my soul, wrote Wordsworth after his brother John died in the wreck of the Abergavenny. And one feels that's a very important point, that suffering is not just negative, but a very important way in which we are opened up to life. And several lines of evidence link depression with the right frontal lobe, which is also the most important brain region in the development of self-other relationships and empathy. And finally, there are values. I don't think these can be fed into an AI device. Values are something that call to us inchoately to begin with until we respond to them and find their value in living them out. These are things like goodness, beauty, truth, and the sacred. I've come to believe that they are probably the most important primary elements in the universe. We certainly don't make them up, but they are aspects of the way in which we dispose our consciousness. So is there a left hemisphere contribution to religion? There is a positive one, and I think Fraser referred to it yesterday. It's the need for a certain level of conceptual intelligence to recognize something beyond at all. I don't think animals can do that. And, of course, very importantly, that needs to be fused with the more intuitive, more ancient mind that possibly animals do represent. But on the negative side, it's less congenial to the mystical, more to the systematic. It prizes the written word over the visual image or music, tends to take the written word literally, is relatively uneasy with unknowing and would claim certainty, lacks an understanding of embodied worship, including the metaphorical nature of icons and statues, sees them as literally what they're thinking they're gods, and it has no concept of metaphor. It doesn't see religion as a historical and cultural phenomenon with its own context, but would see religion as timeless and universal, believes that religion could be used to control the uncertainties of the future, absolute power of prayer, and that it would bring its true believers power and material wealth. Unable to accept the creativity of negation or active passivity, it would have a belief in its own capacity to make things happen. And it would see the dark side as simply to be rejected, suffering as purely negative and to be eliminated. I mean, of course, unnecessary suffering is a very good thing to eliminate. I spent my life as a doctor trying to do that, but that's not the point I'm making. Two final points. The left hemisphere produces representations rather than the encounter of presencing. That's a Heideggerianism, but it's trying to get away from the idea that something just is present in a passive way, but that we help to bring it into being for us. And this is something one can do when looking at the world mindfully. The representations are different. Wordsworth is constantly talking about the difference between the kind of adult's eye of a beautiful landscape. Oh, it's a picturesque landscape, let me take a shot of it. And the being there with it and seeing deep into the core of it. And I believe that the way we think now is one in which representations, maps, theories, diagrams, simple as they are, have taken over from the rich, wonderful, beautiful complexity of life. And AI will take us much further in that direction. You can make it simulate life as much as you like. No doubt over the next few years it will be made to simulate humans better and better. But simulation is an asymptotic process in which you approach something but never reach it. And then I want to make the distinction finally between fantasy and imagination. So fantasy, this is a big topic. It's again covered in my book. It's an important thing for Wordsworth and Coleridge again. But fantasy is what takes us away from reality. Imagination, we now have been taught, is also something that takes you away from reality. But I believe powerfully with Coleridge that imagination is our only chance of getting into whatever it is we're looking at. It's looking patiently and with care, feels organ at whatever it is that we're encountering and not substituting our representation or a fantasy built on it. Fantasy is childish. Fantasy puts together bits of the already known world, whereas imagination can bring us to see for the first time something we thought we knew but had never fully known. So spiritual intelligence, I think it's different from yesterday. It was very well, could there be mass intelligence on? There could, but there's a subtle difference of level in what we're talking about. one recognizes there is mass intelligence, but one might say, I don't have it. But what spiritual intelligence is about is realizing that there's something there at all, that there is a realm of the spirit. That's what we mean. We can't ever fully understand it. It doesn't mean a way of thinking, but an awareness of something existing at all. And no, there can be no spiritual understanding in AI, since spiritual understanding is seamlessly meshed with the body, its perceptions and feelings, its capacity for reverberative, loving relationship, and profoundly entwined, in fact, with the experience of love, suffering, forgiveness, and mortality. So I ask, why would we want AI, given the risks it poses? The left hemisphere and its tools, one of which is AI, aim only to give us more power. We don't need to become more powerful. We need to grow in wisdom. Thank you.
I have to say that since a few weeks ago when I volunteered foolishly to give this response, I've been dwelling in a mix of excitement and misery. Especially when I found out that he's not going to provide the text. But that's not entirely true because I did have a text. 800,000 word one. So this is just a shorter volume. I brought this all the way from the Netherlands just to be able to make this joke. And to get an autograph from I heard it's called costly signaling in evolutionary. So, but yeah, to be honest, I think his critics should be forced to hold the 2 volumes in their hands while they criticize, just to show that they've done the work. I keep going. I will put it down because I don't intend to criticize. I keep going from joke to joke, probably because stand-up comedy seems less terrifying than engaging with his work. And yes, well, I think McGilchrist theory is so appealing because it has this huge explanatory power. It explains why we are the way we are, why we do the things we do, and also what we should be doing in order to flourish. If we attend to the world in the way that we're supposed to, that is by allowing the right hemisphere to reign with the help of the left, where needed, the only possible reaction is awe, and the only possible conclusion is that we matter. There exists purpose and meaning in the world. That's what he tells us that the right hemisphere view of the world is. And thus, our religious and artistic intuitions that we are part of something bigger, and they are ultimately correct, despite the left hemisphere's desperation to dismiss them because of its inability to understand them. So the holistic, open, and paradox-tolerant worldview of the right hemisphere seems to be more reliable than the reductionist, narrow, and foolish view of the left. And the implication of all this, which will be music to the ears of theologians and religious scholars, is that most of the problematic mottos of our recent cultural history are nightmares dreamt by the left hemisphere. Reductive materialism, determinism, scientism, that consciousness is just an illusion, that organisms are ultimately machines, that there is no teleology in physical and biological processes, moral relativism, utilitarianism, that what cannot be defined does not matter, that science will eventually come up with a complete theory of reality, etc. And furthermore, the brain lateralization hypothesis provides compelling arguments that many modern intellectual diseases, such as naive positivism, naive deconstructivism, religious fundamentalism, are all left hemisphere fictions. I think there are many interesting convergences and challenges for theological anthropology. So this idea that we are broken inside, this resonates very well with at least with Christian anthropology. But there I notice a difference because in Christian anthropology that is quite very built in, whereas I see McGilchrist locating it very late in history. So apparently there was this period where we were in harmony with nature, and I'm a little bit more hesitant about that, just because, I think this kind of nostalgia obscures other things that were not right. So that would be something I would be curious to hear more about. But there's also this thing that we have this very dominant, domination-prone left hemisphere, which in theological anthropology we can associate with many things that we call sinful, like exploitation of the others, pride, and things like that. And I wonder, this is not for McGilchrist to think about for theologians, what does it mean that is really part and parcel of who we are? So it's not just something that occurred because something went wrong in our history. This is really very much needed in evolutionary history. And I think that is a bit uneasy for the idea of this perfect creature that images got. When I see some convergences, of course, as he pointed as well, with the project of spiritual intelligence. So it seems that there is a move when we are growing in spirituality or wisdom in moving control from the left towards the right. And this is precisely what Fraser has theorized about is happening in spiritual practices, where in cognition you reprioritize this more intuitive family of intelligence over the conceptual ones. So in that sense, I see a lot of convergence. One question that I had naively, he wants to, I know you're not a Christian, at least not belonging officially to any faith denomination, but you must have wondered what the lateralization hypothesis has to say about the gospel and the person of Jesus Christ. I wonder if you see their more right hemisphere features. I say this because in Christian anthropology, Christ is this maximum point towards which human beings can grow. And I wonder whether in what we know about Christ's life and teaching, there's any trace of a more balanced work between the two hemispheres. I would be very disappointed if not. Yes. And personally, I've been very touched by the theological part of his book, especially. I mean, for the first time, I've been attracted to process theology. I also, at some moments, for seconds, I had the feeling that I can grasp Philip Hefner's co-creator, creative co-creator's metaphor. And this idea that what we do matters because we do participate in this larger thing, and it matters also for God, although Gilchrist doesn't use the word God, but whatever is that is apart from us. I find that more appealing than the traditional religious idea that, what you do matters for your own salvation, and maybe it's good to do good to others because, that's you can flourish that way, okay? And but this idea of a God that is not affected by that, whereas in Gilchrist's proposal, which is very much convergent with process theology, I feel recruited in something bigger, and suddenly I felt this urge to really do good because it matters a little bit more. That's just a personal story. And I would just say that for humanities scholars in general and theologians in particular, I think this theory provides a strong and scientifically based argument that can be of great help in our current dilemmas regarding the place of our disciplines in the academic curriculum. So instead of hopelessly pursuing quantitative methods at all costs in the hope of being taken seriously by colleagues who specialize in hard sciences, this might imply that humanities scholars could draw some useful arguments from wider traditional methodologies and approaches are equally important, if not even more important, for our collective pursuit of knowledge and truth. And what McGilchrist says is that, I quote, the most fundamental truths of both a physical and a psychical nature can ultimately be expressed only in terms of poetry. And I think theologians could not agree more.
And I was reminded of a letter Darwin wrote to a friend after Asa Gray had published a review of his work in Nature. And he said, Asa Gray understands my work so well that in future, when I want to know what it is I'm saying, I will ask Asa Gray. There were a couple of things that you almost asked me to respond to. One is you stated I'm not a Christian, and I felt a sort of stab I know you didn't intend that, of course, but it's so difficult well, it is for me, to know how to respond to that. In some ways, I absolutely am, in that I know no mythos that is more rich, that is more resonant with me than that of Christianity. If I'm asked about the historical Christ, that's where I become, well, does it matter so much? And I know that for many theologians that's to be a heretic, but if so, I'm a heretic. But at least my heart is very much in the right place. And the reason I don't come full on about that in my chapter on the sense of the sacred is that I wanted it to be as inclusive as possible. I wanted people who are not religious, particularly, or of other religions, to feel at home with what I was saying, because I think it covers a very broad ground. And so, but you asked me, does the hemisphere hypothesis have something to say about it? It has lots of things to say about it. I mean, one is the whole idea of the incarnation of this divine thing. It's something that speaks very much to the right hemisphere, which is much more grounded in bodily existence and much less liable to go off on a purely abstract riff. And Christ's work was largely to place the right hemisphere before the left, to say, the scribes and Pharisees say this, that, and the other, and you must follow these rules. But I say there is only one or two commandments: love God and love thy neighbour. So I think he was speaking for everything that I'm talking about. I mean, absolutely and utterly. So it's just that I didn't want to kind of ram Christianity down the throat of my reader if they didn't already get it. And I think of Christ's words: we must be as wise as serpents and as gentle as doves. And I think sometimes in order to do the work, one has to hold back a little. Anyway, the other one I wanted to pick up was, I don't know quite where you got this bit from, and this would be my only demur. I don't say that there was a sort of Garden of Eden time when everything was perfect. Not at all. Or that we were just at one with nature. I never said that. What I've said is there were times when the civilization was functioning as well as a civilization can function across the board, the sciences, the arts, and so on. And there were other times when it wasn't working. I mean, now is one. So that's all I was doing, is, as always, not saying absolute things, but saying relative things. And I also just want to gloss the idea of romanticism, because it's a terrific book down and it scores points immediately. But I actually think we need to rehabilitate the idea, if only there was another word for it. But in fact, the period that we call romanticism was probably the one of the greatest insights of our Western civilization. And the period of philosophy that comes around that time was more sophisticated. The writings of Schelling and Hegel and so on, I think, are more sophisticated than much that came after, although I'm a great admirer of the 20th century philosophers, particularly Whitehead, and the phenomenological tradition. Yeah. Thanks.